Hi, good afternoon. This is Mary Beth Landy coming from Federation for Children with Special Needs, and I'd like to welcome Stephanie Gard here today from the Attachment and Trauma Institute. Stephanie is going to be talking about therapeutic parenting and understanding trauma. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'll briefly introduce myself. I'm Stephanie Gard. I am a retired legal services disability attorney who adopted her first child from state custody. He was placed with us when he was 5 and he was adopted when he was 6. And I gave birth to my second child about a year later. I've been volunteering with the Attachment and Trauma Network since 2009, and my sons are now 23 and 16. And our family lives down on the south coast of Massachusetts. The pictures here that you see are, the right one is Adoption Day with my older son, and our family is on the left. And a big day for us is the bottom left. That's when my older son graduated from high school. The Attachment and Trauma Network was created over 20 years ago by some moms in the Midwest who discovered that their adopted children had some very similar behaviors. Today, with over 500 members, we provide support, education, and advocacy, mainly using the internet and online services for families raising children with trauma and attachment issues. Our main concentration right now, including a conference in February, is trauma-sensitive schools and bringing more trauma-sensitive education into the school systems. We provide support groups for families, and we're based mainly on volunteers. So I wanted to briefly discuss the struggle that adopted children and children with trauma and attachment issues, what they struggle with in school. And to kind of summarize it briefly before we go into trauma in general and what it does to the brain, you look at what adopted children have when they come into a school. They're dealing with significant loss, usually more loss than a neurotypical child. There's grief in the losses that they've experienced. There's usually complex family relationships. Sometimes there's still visitation. There's open adoptions. There's a lot going on, and there are separated sibling groups as well. We've got the cultural differences that adoption can entail, and all of that, including the trauma, can impact how a child learns. This is a pretty powerful but incredibly true quote by Adam Pertman, that children who are adopted have early life trauma that they have to deal with. And I want to put a little bit of focus on the ACEs and talk about it in this slide. I highly recommend that you take a look at the websites and learn a little bit more about ACEs scores. It's something that schools can really learn and attach to, specifically because it was a very scientific study. And it was done by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente in the 90s, although they continue to monitor it to this day because of how powerful the results are. What they discovered through ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences, is that there were 10 that could be quantifiably measured. And they're listed here. We've got the abuse, the neglect, and studies are also showing that the neglect can even have a more significant impact on a child's brain than sometimes the physical abuse. If you have a family member who has any of these issues, the alcohol and the substance abuse being a big one in a lot of the families that we're seeing right now, or simply being absent because of prison. Also, if you're witnessing a primary caregiver being abused, that is considered a very strong ACE. And losing a parent, and divorce is in there. They've added it since, and it is considered an adverse childhood experience. The main discoveries from the ACEs study are listed on the right, and the amazing things that they discovered was, first of all, it's very common. Over half the population has at least one adverse childhood experience. there's a significant correlation in the adult onset of chronic disease with people who have higher ACE scores. They usually do not occur alone. If you have one, chances are you have more than one. And the more you have, the more risk you have for disease, mental illness, and being a victim of violence. And it contributes to most of our major chronic health, mental health, economic health, and social health issues. This is very significant, and it's just starting to be understood in the mainstream and in schools across the country. It also doesn't matter what ACE you have. It's all toxic stress, and it all plays a big part on the brain. So I wanted to go over it briefly, but especially if you're working with a school, this is something you can go to their websites, take a look at, print out the study, print out even the measured ACEs and the discoveries, and bring it in, and it helps you educate people about it. So in talking about trauma and children, we've got a basic traumatic event like a car accident. It's distressing, it's outside the norm for your daily schedule, it's intense in the feelings, and it's usually considered one event. The best example, again, is the car accident, something like that happening. Complex trauma is prolonged exposure to that type of event. So imagine the feeling you have when you're in a car accident and having that feeling daily for years. That's complex trauma, and that's what many of the children that we work with and that you work with, this is what they experience. Dr. Dan Siegel does a lot of work in the brain area, and he uses the term interpersonal neurobiology. It's just fancy words for how your brains relate to each other. He likes to talk about how the brains are wired for connection, and that relationships and connection are very essential to building resilience in children. Children they're not resilient just because they're children. They're resilient because they have the connection and the relationships. So in being wired for connection, the normal trust cycle is that a baby has a need, expresses it through their behaviors, which is crying, it's met, and trust develops. That's the typical cycle. In children with trauma, we have a baby whose needs are not met. The caregiver is not meeting the needs no matter how the baby expresses it, and mistrust develops. On YouTube, there's a fantastic video of a mother and child where the mother plays with the child, interacts with the child, and then at a certain point turns away from the child, makes her face blank, and turns back and faces the child. I recommend that you look at it. It's highly distressing because the baby actually becomes very upset very quickly. That's what's happening on a daily basis with our children. So this is where the mistrust develops. And remember, this is the primary caregiver who's not meeting the needs. Another great thing to talk about when you're dealing with schools and teachers is the idea of the brain science behind it. Dr. Dan Siegel's fantastic. That's him with one of our teacher trainers. And the idea of the hand model. And I think the best part about it is the idea of flipping your lid. So you've got to remember that the brain develops from the bottom up and the inside out. So you've got the spinal cord, you've got the skull. The important thing is the limbic region in here, the amygdala. And then as a child gets older, you've got the cortex development, and the typical brain of a neurotypical person is set like this. The problem with our children is the amygdala is being overstimulated, and so we've got the flip your lid scenario. And it's really important to understand that, and actually this teacher trainer here, she taught her third graders about it. And to have that language was so powerful for these children that they can go up to their teacher and say, I'm feeling like I'm going to flip my lid. And that's such an important to have this language with children younger than even third grade. It's fantastic to have this. They understand what's going on with just this simple model. So the idea of the brain is that children can't do any more than what their brains are developing at. We don't ask a 6-month-old to pick up all of his or her toys. We can't expect more from these children. And children with trauma, even though they might be 6 years old, may still be functioning at a much lower level. So we have to understand that with children with trauma. There's a lot of hardwiring going on in the brain. And if you're not using certain parts of the brain will put other connections in there. And so especially with our children being in a constant state of fear, that's going to make the amygdala grow a lot bigger. And we've got kids who are hardwired to go straight to that fight, flight, freeze. And so that's where we're at with many of these children. And I think the idea of hardwiring and the wires forming together, many of us who drive cars can get in our car and start the car and drive the car without really thinking too much about what you're doing. You might have to think about it if you switch into someone else's car. But our brain has put all those wires together and we're all set to do that. With our children, if they've been in a life of chaos already, that's where they're hardwired to go. And it's something to remember that these children, their default gateway is to go to chaos. So good news, the brain can work around that. We can work with trauma. And the more that we do and the more that we understand, the better our children have a chance to rewire their brains to work with the trauma that they have. So when we talk about therapeutic parenting, the first thing we do is talk to the parents. People don't understand why. Why are we talking about the parents? Isn't it the child? Fix my child. Why are we working with the parents? Well, years of work has really shown us that the parents need to be trauma informed and ready to work in a therapeutic manner to help these children. We need to help the parents and we need to support the parents. When you take a child into your home that has a traumatic past, all the things and all the expectations that you had usually shift. The idea of the family interactions you've had, the thought in your mind of how you were going to parent, and the meaning of family, that all changes when you add a traumatized child. The lower right is my son. He was about 8 years old in this picture. That's actually a pretty good picture of him. Those are not angry eyes. Those are actually pretty sad eyes. He has a lot of shame inside him. But he was working pretty hard at that point with therapists to work through his traumas. But I always like putting pictures up of real-life children, you know, to show you that's what's going on behind their eyes. When you start working with the trauma in a child, as one of my friends, Anna, says, it touches us right back, and it doesn't touch us back lightly. It changes everything in your life, and it's really important that you're prepared to deal with some of the things, or if you're in the middle of it, to start gaining some perspective to help you manage, you know, the next 10 to 20 years with a child with trauma issues. Every child is different, and that's really important to note. Some children develop their own resilience, and some children need a lot of work. We also see that it doesn't matter when the trauma occurred, and it also doesn't matter what type of trauma. We have several families with children with very difficult issues that were adopted at birth. My son, we adopted him at 5, and he had some pretty significant issues as well. So it's always good to keep an open mind and not think that one child and one path is going to be the same. One of the things that we have to deal with all the time, and I think many parents understand this, is society's expectations. Here's a list of what we hear all the time. A little more love, just hug them more, spank them more. We hear both. That children are resilient, and we already touched on that a little bit. That children don't remember the trauma. You have to define what remember means, and we'll go into that a little bit. Parenting does not come naturally for all of us, and I think that that's a big one to remember. and especially this type of parenting. You may have been raised by fantastic parents who really knew what they were doing, and you think you're going to do the same thing with these children, and you get a child with a trauma history and it just doesn't work. Children are not bad seeds, they're not bad parents, they're not bad children. You know, we're dealing with the trauma, and that's the bad part. I have not met a child who was grateful for being removed from a home, actually. Most of them are not grateful. That is their normal, and when they're removed from it, even if it was a very difficult, abusive, neglectful situation, that was their normal. They are not grateful for it, and they shouldn't be. You know, that is not the expectation that we should have for these children. The idea that a child's behavior is a reflection of the teacher or of the parent. I think the Walmart scenarios are always the best. You don't know what that family is going through, and we all kind of sometimes want to put a sign on it. It's not me. It's not me. It's my child's trauma. But I have to say the public is getting a little more understanding, I think, with parenting situations that become a little loud in certain places in public. Children don't necessarily want to please unless it's a gain for them. And I'm sure it's very clear that spanking does nothing and is something that should never be done, either with a neurotypical child, but most especially a traumatized child. It doesn't work. So just understanding that I believe most of these are untrue as you know, basic theory, but you take a child with trauma and none of them are true. So when we're facing all of that, we have to look at shifting our thoughts from, you know, what's wrong with you, which I remember myself saying over and over again, to what happened to you. And as a teacher, a school can also be looking at that as well. Why is your behavior this way? No, what happened to you to make you want to communicate to me in this behavior? So we have to reframe our role as a parent, as a teacher. We have to see the children for what they are. They are professional survivors. My son had no concern about us as his parents except to know whether we were going to take care of his special diet. He has a metabolic disorder. And when you realize that only 2 months before he had been in a home for adoption and that family had changed their minds, you can understand why he had no desire to attach to us, to wonder anything more about us except whether we would take care of him. Their ages are usually, the developmental age and the chronological age, significantly different. You may have a 16-year-old boy who's tall and strong and big, and he's really developmentally 5. And you can't expect a lot more from a child who's having those issues because of the trauma, except to meet them where they're at. A lot of their traumas happened when they were pre-verbal. And so asking a child to explain, well, what's going on in your mind, what are you thinking, doesn't always get the answer you're looking for, and a lot of times they don't know. My son was able to tell us he just didn't feel good inside. He also was able to tell us that he heard voices, which ended up not being a psychotic break, but being more of a PTSD, remembering people fighting in a home when he was probably 1 or 2. So you have to realize that their feelings are very different than us as well. We may think, we may know actually for certain that they're in a safe place. And we can tell our children, you're safe. But they're not feeling safe yet. And a lot of times you have to do a little bit extra to let your child get to the point of feeling safe. Even though you could say to the child, you are safe, you're in our home, the doors are locked. My son needed to go around the house with me and make sure all the windows and doors were locked. Then he was fine. You have to meet them at their reality. And teachers have need to have the same understanding in a classroom where the teacher knows that they're safe, but maybe the child needs to be in a certain part of the room, or the child needs to be near a certain student, or needs to be near the teacher to feel safe. So this is how we're reframing and rethinking our role to include the child and the trauma in the planning. These children are also very catastrophic thinkers. My son had issues with me leaving home for anything. He also had issues with any kind of school vacation, and summer vacation was the worst, but even Christmas vacation coming up, he would have a very difficult time, and through therapy, he was able to tell us it was because he felt that those children were dying. Losing those children felt like they were all dead to him. And when I would leave to go to the grocery store, he felt the loss as if I had died. And he felt that over and over and over again. They really have this different, because some of them had people leave and never come back. So it's very important to understand their view, and that it is very negative. So when you look at embracing this new normal, this new understanding with a child with trauma, you need to start matching their meanings. When they feel safe, then they're safe, even though we know they're safe. And it's not about us, which is very difficult, and we do talk about self-care in here, of course, but it's not about us, and they are not making us miserable. They're not ruining our lives. It is about them, and it is about their traumatic history. And I can tell you, you know, there are days of the week where I do feel it's about me, and my kid is making me miserable, and that's okay. It's important to just get back to this and understand that the only way that you're going to help your child is to, you know, understand and become helpful in their healing process. At the Attachment and Trauma Network, we've worked with modalities for 20 years, different ways of helping children. It has evolved immensely since people first started realizing what trauma was in a child and what it was doing to them. But we've kind of boiled it down to, we have seven tenets, and the first 4 are really about the child, and the last 3 are about the caregivers. But this comes from all different modalities out there, and we just kind of boil it down to some really important key factors. When you have a child in your home with a trauma history, these are things that can really help. The first one is safety. We use the mama bear. And it's really important that the child feels safe. We've talked about it already. But the idea that they need to feel safe. My son felt safer when we put a door alarm on his door. We didn't have a lock on his door, but he had this, I would call it irrational fear, but it's a fear to him. We live on the 2nd floor of a cape, or we sleep on the 2nd floor of our house. He thought coyotes were going to break into our house, run up the stairs, go to his bedroom, and get him. Okay, well, what do we need to do? And we kind of sat down as a team. He was 7, 8 years old. What do we need to do? And he wanted to go around and lock the doors. And I said, he's like, well, you're sleeping. You won't hear when they come in. And I said, okay, well, how about an alarm? And he said, that would be great. And so that helped him. Now, are coyotes going to break in? No, they're probably not going to break into our house, but that helped him feel safe. The other component of safety is that everyone in the family is safe, and I know many families have to deal with this as well, where we've got a child that is being unsafe in the home. So by making sure everyone is safe, you're actually showing the traumatized child how strong you are. And you do what you need to do, whether it's the therapy, working on the therapist with a plan for when the child becomes unsafe. And we recommend all along that you work with experienced trauma therapists. You really can't go it alone. So with them, you develop plans for helping this child, and you have crisis teams. If you can find, crisis teams in Massachusetts, there are crisis teams available. Adoption Journeys can work with you. I'm sure there are several other places too. But to have a plan in place and actually plan for it, your child is going to probably be unsafe again if they've already been that way. So safety is the key component. It's the first thing we talk to when we talk to families, making sure everyone in the house feels safe. The next 2 are the idea of a balance of structure and nurture, and that's the key component to therapeutic parenting. And it's a balance that we try to achieve, and try is definitely the operative word. Structure is definitely consistency, but not punishment. And here's some examples. The schedule, the routine, very important for our children, especially when they're first placed in our home. taking your child to Disney World after you adopt them sounded like a great idea to us. And it was fairly successful, but when I look back at the pictures of him, it wasn't the best idea in the world. But a lot of families, it's what they want to do. Really keeping it nice and simple, keeping the child in the home, and then starting to develop a schedule that the child can count on is really important. Keeping your word, wow, this is big also. Everything is big, but my son is now 23 and he knows I say what I mean. I have never lied to him. He lies to me to this day, but he knows I will not lie to him. If you are going to threaten, and I suggest you don't threaten, make sure that you're ready to ground them for 50 weeks or whatever comes out of your mouth at that time. Make sure that you're ready to do that. There's a lot to that. The child feels safer if you mean what you say and you follow through on whatever you've said. But the idea of offering choices and threatening isn't the best with children with trauma histories. And a lot of choices can be painted in ways that are really threats, actually. So it's something to work on instead of our initial reaction to a child's behavior. A lot of times from when we've grown up is to threaten. Stop this now, or, and I remember telling my son once, if you do that one more time, I couldn't even get out the rest of the sentence because he did it one more time. He was like, okay, I want to see what you're going to do. So these are the ideas of structure, and you combine it with nurture. And nurturing is not spoiling a child. It's not being indulgent. It's not being weak. It's not putting them in front of the TV for 24 hours too. But it's trying to be there with them and to give them that care and the developmental piece that will help them grow. When we talk about examples, I always have to, when I change to talk about this, I always have to put in what the child can tolerate. These usually work great with children, even children with trauma. But every child is different in how they can accept nurturing, and working with your therapist, working, with your team. It's important to know what they can tolerate. But the affection, the praise, hugging, cuddling, all of those things, very important. My son couldn't take a lot of affection. We called it the drive-by huggings, or the pat on the back, or the fist bump, or it's something to have a little connection with them was very helpful for him. With my son also, he couldn't take praise. He couldn't take any praise whatsoever. So I would go in and say the horse stall is clean, and our horse is going to sleep very well tonight because she's going to be warm and she's got fresh water. This is great. She's going to have a great night tonight. Because if I would go in and say, you did a great job on the stall, the next day I would have to work with him probably 5 or 6 times to make sure he actually cleaned all of the stall. He can't handle praise even to this day. It's very difficult for him. It's a scary place for him to be. When we talk about humor, and I have I think it's funny, we'll see. Sarcasm cannot be a part of it with children with trauma histories. And I am very good at sarcasm. My husband and I rule the day with sarcasm. And so this is something you have to learn when you're around that child, that it's humorous, it's goofy humor. My son did well with potty humor. It was hilarious to talk about farts and poop. So that's the type of thing you have to work towards. And your message has to be not just what's coming out of your mouth, but what your body's saying and what your eyes are saying. And you need to school yourself to give that response to your child. And what you find when you start practicing some of these things is that a lot of the fight goes out of them. And my son made huge strides. The more I could pull myself together and get into this mode, which is not easy and takes a lot of practice, my son would do a lot better. Dr. Purvis is fantastic at describing what the perfect parent should be, but this is where therapeutic parenting aims to go, with not just children with trauma histories, but any child. This is what we want from our children. We want them to try new things, but we also need to be able to keep them safe, and we need to teach them how to respect the people around them. and we are not going to stay balanced all the time. So when you look at an unbalanced situation, when you're doing the structure and nurture, too much structure is the control battles. It's the threats, the punishments, not allowing for any spontaneity. Although when you have a new child in your home, it's good to keep it easygoing, and when you're ready to change up the schedule, that you do it gradually if you can. Too much nurture is just as negative, and it was very hard for my son to deal with teachers who were too nurturing. They felt bad for him, and they wouldn't hold him to any standards, and he felt the most unsafe in those classrooms, and so the behaviors were much worse in those classrooms. They really don't think you're very smart. And my son had a test for teachers, and the main test was he would misspell his name on papers at the beginning of the year. And if the teacher didn't catch it or call him on it, he felt incredibly unsafe. And we would tell teachers that, and some teachers just felt that, well, he doesn't need, he knows his name, it's not a big deal. I said, no, it's more than that. It's a safety issue for him. And there were some teachers that understood and worked with it, and there were some teachers who, I had a teacher tell me they didn't have time to do that, to correct the name on the paper. So that was the teacher who actually, yeah, he had a breakdown in third grade or in fourth grade, and I got a call that he was crawling around the classroom and had scared everybody, and really it was just he didn't feel safe. And so these are the types of things that we see in the behaviors of our children. So when it's unbalanced, we see the rejection of any kind of nurturing, even the babies with the arched backs. There's a lot of rejection there. They're frightened by fun. And again, if you do it one more time and they do it, they're gonna test your threats all the time. And the change is difficult for them too. Any kind of change, very, very difficult. Losing a therapist because the therapist is moving on somewhere else. Losing a pediatrician because a pediatrician is going, any of that is going to impact them. And as you're doing this, it's good to just keep that mindset that I love you regardless of the behaviors. You're driving me nuts right now, but I love you. And it's good to keep that going in the back of your head when you're dealing with a child with a trauma history. Staying connected is another important piece of therapeutic parenting. Find what works to connect with your child. Again, respect their boundaries. Parallel connection is great. Even when they flip their lid, it's great to be in the room with them and say, look, you flipped your lid. If you've had the talk with them and they understand the brain function, you can say, look, you flipped your lid. This is just a fact. I'm not going to sit here and tell you to calm down, but I'm going to be here with you. And when you're done, we can talk. And when you feel better, if there's something I can get you, let me know. Safety is paramount. If they're throwing things at you, that's not going to work. But I'm here for you no matter what. I'm not going anywhere. Those are important things for them to hear when their amygdala is being triggered. It can pull them back out of that mode that they're in. The other idea is to pay attention to what works for them specifically and find different ways to connect. I've made a list of things here, and I have 3 pictures here, and yes, that is a toilet. The first one, though, is my son driving our small boat. He terrified of doing anything, and we were in a pond with no other boats there, and I said, hey, do you want to drive? And the look on his face was very interesting, and he actually said yes. So that's him. He is frozen stiff, scared to death, but he drove the boat, and he was very proud of himself. And he's like, Dad, can you take a picture just so I can show my friends that I drove a boat? So that was a big thing for him, and it was a great connection for us. We find driving in the car, too, to be very helpful because we don't have to make the eye contact with him, which can be scary for him. So let's go to the toilet seat. This was a fantastic thing. If you look on the far right picture, that smile on his face is a very genuine, happy time for him. There is another kid in a gray shirt. That's my younger son. They were bored. We were working on, it was a shutdown house, so the toilet was actually empty and absolutely clean. I didn't have my kids in a dirty toilet. But they were bored, and I said, we have a new toilet seat. I don't know. Do you guys think you can do this? Oh, sure. They grabbed it, they took it, and they went to work. And they put in the new toilet seat, took off the old one. I have pictures of them holding the toilet seat. They were so proud of it. But the funny thing was all the giggles that were happening when they did it. And this was just, these are the things that you find. It can be as simple as that. It can be as simple as a water fight in the kitchen. Not a fight, but you know what I mean. You know, they make a mistake and spill water, you spill your water too, and you all laugh about it. It's things like that that you find these connections for these children. My son still remembers this. He remembers the day we changed the toilet seat. So parenting these children, it's a very intentional act. You have to be on a lot. You are a first responder. We'll talk about that a little bit too. You're doing this with a goal to help this child heal. So you have to be present. The emperor penguin sits on the egg and then on the baby through blizzards and huge cold snowstorms while the other parent goes and gets the food. Very intentional, and that's why we use that picture. You have to make some tough choices sometimes depending on what the child needs. But they did not get those early beginnings that they needed. And so sometimes if we can change our lives a little bit to be able to provide that for them, it's going to make a world of difference. It's not for the faint of heart. However, if you are a faint of heart person, that doesn't mean you can't do it. You'd be surprised what you can find in yourself with the right support and the right team. The tag team approach is great if you have a partner in your life. I think it's important to also be with your partner, but my husband and I would tag team a lot. And he knew if he came home from work that I had a look in my eyes, he wouldn't even go upstairs and change. He would just get right into it so I could go upstairs, or I could go, you know, sit in the bedroom for 5 minutes and take some deep breaths, or do whatever, or eat a candy bar or something to just say, all right, I need a breather. And knowing that he was coming home sometimes was what I lived for. So having that tag team approach is helpful. Single parents have the same team that they can build around them. And they have to probably do it with a little more force to get somebody to be around, maybe not when you get home, but to create a team around you to support you. It's just as important with single parents. As an example, changing your lives, I was an attorney. We knew within the first 2 months when he was placed with us how severe his issues were. And so I was working for legal services at the time, and I went in and said, I have to give my notice. In fact, I never went back after our adoption leave, because we just knew that it was going to be better. And I have to say that it was the best thing we could have done. We had to make some serious financial, changes in our lives, and the cost of our son and his therapy was very high, but we don't regret a single minute of it. And it's really important to realize that sometimes you do have to say, whoa, it does seem like we both need to work, but maybe there's a way we could work around that. And one of you might be able to stay home. So we've just talked about all of this, and you're getting some ideas, and it sounds really difficult. It sounded difficult to me initially, but I've got some news for you. It's a process, and I have a therapist who's fantastic here in Massachusetts, and his one comment to me when I talked to him about a year ago about therapeutic parenting was, first of all, therapeutic parenting needs to involve a therapist, needs to involve at least one therapist who's trauma-informed. The other thing is that we're not perfect, and we're going to make a ton of mistakes, and if we can do it 30% of the time, and the rest of the time we're making mistakes and fixing them and, putting on my big girl panties and going back out there and being his mom, and having my husband, take a deep breath and get back into it, that's what's going to help these children. So don't think that you have to immediately change your life and be the most perfect therapeutic parent in the world, because I think actually the definition of a therapeutic parent is imperfect. So just keep that in mind if you feel overwhelmed about it, because just doing a little bit here and there makes a huge difference with these kids. And what you're trying to see and stop from impacting you is that downward spiral of not getting what you thought you were going to get from a child. You know, the big thing of, I took my son to Disney World, he should really be happy about it. He should thank me. He should be great. And he's not. And I don't feel good about it. And why should I do anything for him again? This is a downward spiral that parents can feel. And not just a Disney World trip, but I made cookies and, you know, he didn't eat them, or he said they tasted bad, or something like that. It's good to recognize that downward spiral, and as my therapist says in my face all the time, be the adult and understand that it's a downward spiral that we need to fix as parents and pull ourselves out of. And just be aware of it. There are a lot of things that you can change. Big one would be preparing. If your child has had rages, tantrums, chances are they're going to have another one. Prepare for it. If you have a child who's dangerous in a car, that's a big one that about 15 years ago we started working on the idea of, you know what, just go out with the children where you don't have to go anywhere, but the children don't know that. And prepare like you always do to get in the car and go. If the child starts acting unsafe, pull over and show the child, look, I love you too much to drive unsafely. We're in an unsafe condition. What can we do? Pull over. The child's thinking that, and this is their trauma talking, that they are going to stop you from going somewhere. And there's a little control, there's a little negative feedback they're getting that feels good to their brains. But if you are not rushed, you are not going to have those intense reactions as a parent, you know, get in that seat, you know, before I throw you in the seat, or just you've ruined my whole day, and then you shame the kid. Just go out when you have time. And yeah, is it a waste of a couple hours? It might be, but you would be surprised how they react. And we have a lot of families who've tried this and have had a lot of success, especially with dangerous children in cars. The kids who get out of the seats, the kids who throw things. You need to work on that because you're going to have to drive places. So grieve all through my life with my son, especially Facebook. Facebook's great at showing you what a child that age might be doing that your child isn't doing. You know, I'm happy that my child made it to school without a school refusal, and somebody's posting that their kid just won a tennis championship or something like that. Grieve that, but love your kid where they're at too. Make mistakes. Know that you're making mistakes. Tell your child, oh, I just made a mistake. I'm going to fix this, you know. The support that you can find, a lot of online support groups, and several families I know use Al-Anon, especially with older children in their home. Very helpful for the idea that you can love someone who has behaviors and flaws. They found Al-Anon to be very, very helpful. The little joys, you know, the toilet type scenarios, the toilet seat scenarios. Redefine your family, who's around you, rewrite your story if you need to. But understand that it's a constantly changing situation. We talked about your job description, parenting a child, even being a teacher of a child with trauma issues. You're a healer, you're the first responder, you're an advocate, many of you are advocates, and you're a trauma worker on top of it all. So when you think about first responders, think about some of these things that first responders have. They have their toolkits. They have shifts that they work, and they get help for really serious situations. So let's start putting together a toolbox. You know, go home and talk about what kind of tools you need in your toolbox to help you out, because this is what you're doing. You are doing these on top of being a parent. Our three last cards talk about how to live the life with a child. This is a long haul, and you are not alone. We say that all the time. The elephant herd is great for showing how different family members, team members, herd members help you raise a child. But you need to find other people out there that will support you. A lot of times, especially with children with trauma histories, the primary caregiver needs to get help as well. If they have ACEs as well, if they have adverse childhood experiences, their children can trigger those. And it's just a tough situation. When I dealt with my ACEs, I was a much calmer parent for my son, and he made huge strides. So don't be afraid to get help for yourself. You don't have to blame the child. You don't have to blame yourself, but it's helpful to have that support. Support groups are great. In Massachusetts, you've got adoption journey support groups for families that have adopted. Online, we have lots of support groups available out there. I would just warn people, especially with the Facebook support groups that are out there, they're not all therapeutic. I know that there's still one that really likes to talk about the Tabasco sauce on the tongue when the children act up. None of that works with a child with a trauma history. So you want to look at support groups that have some moderation to them and talk about trauma-informed ideas, some of the things that we're talking about. Venting is very important, but it needs to be followed up afterward with ideas of, okay, I just had a horrible day, my kid was horrible, I was horrible. Yes, we can vent about it, but what should I do to make tomorrow better? It's that combination you need to find in support groups. We at the Attachment and Trauma Network do have private moderated support groups for families for our members, and we have free memberships, so it's not a cost issue. And create the community of support around you. The people that were there when you first adopted or took in a child with trauma may not be the people who are there now. And that's a tough thing sometimes, but we had to put some distance between ourselves and people who judged us all the time. And we're better off for it for many different reasons. But wherever you're at, find the support system. It could be as simple as people in your community, people on sports teams, people in your church, places like that. You can find people to support you. Taking care of the rest of the herd, you've got your partner. If you're in a partnership, you've got a primary caregiver and a secondary caregiver, and those are two very distinct jobs. The secondary caregiver, usually their main job is to support the primary. In my house, I was the primary and my husband was the secondary. And it's good to understand that situation. We could switch that role sometimes, but when you switch the role, you need to do your job, whatever the job was at the time. And that's why my husband would just come home after a long day of work and do what needed to be done to give me a break. Keep up the lines of communication. Make time for yourselves. And we say things like that, and it doesn't seem possible. We're not saying Tahiti, but we're saying maybe go to Lowe's together. Something like that. It's really important to make that time for you and your partner, and have a unified front. We've had this conversation with parents before. If you aren't on the same page with your partner, you need to get on the same page if you're parenting a child with trauma. If you can't get on the same page, you need to figure something out. These children can really increase the incidence of divorce or separation. I do know some families who have separated just to keep the family members safe. That's not what should happen. There should be more support services there for families going through this. But if you have a partner who's just not going to get on the page with you, you really need to sit down and look at a plan for your family, whether it's going to involve a partner or not involve the partner. And that's just what you and your family need. We did therapy with our son. Actually, it was my husband, myself, two therapists, and my younger son was only 7 months old when we started therapy, so he usually stayed out in the waiting room with my father. It's intense therapy, and it did wonders. It really, really did. I think my son's alive today because we were able to work through some of his traumas. Understand your roles. Don't let the kids divide you, not just the triangulation that we see. And we see this with teachers as well. Well, my teacher said I didn't have any homework. And, and the teacher said, well, he said that mom said you weren't doing homework tonight, or something like that. Don't let them divide you. When we started, there wasn't texting. Now, texting is so much easier because you can get a straight answer from your partner very quickly as to what was said. But physically, also not letting the kids divide you. My husband and I, we hold hands still after 27 years. We're still holding hands a lot, to the embarrassment of our sons, which we love to do. But even in pictures, when we go to church, we don't have the boys between us. My husband and I are always together, and we have the boys around us. And I understand that sometimes families feel the need to corral the kids in the middle between them, but you want to present a unified front. So sometimes if you think about that physicality in the house, where you sit at dinner, where you sit at McDonald's, places like that, it can give a very strong positive picture to the children. If you're single, make the support system. I'm actually, I support a single mom, and we do a lot of texting. We just support each other texting all the time. We check in with each other. I've provided respite for her. Her daughters come down and clean my horse stalls with my kids and stuff like that. And it's something that it's going to be a little more difficult, but it's certainly something that you can do and something that you need to do for your child. Keep the people around you, keep them close if they're supporting you. If they're judgmental, I think it's always the grandparents, you know, they're really good sometimes for that 30-minute, you know, tell me I'm a bad parent, but just let me go out to the store type of thing. But find other people around you that will give you the full support and the full understanding and are even willing to learn. We see this a lot in families who have children with illnesses. Let's just use cancer as a big example. That child is going to get more energy and more time from the family, from the parents, from everyone, than the other children will. It's a part of life in a family like that. And it's something that happens in our families too. A lot of our time and energy goes to one child, or, you know, the children that have the trauma issues. So it doesn't make it a horrible situation. It just makes it something you need to be aware of and something you need to work on. The other children in the family need to be safe, and they can work on that safety plan with you. My son was 6 when he created his first safety plan because his older brother was 13 and was starting to really act out. And all my son needed to do, he decided he wanted to go in his room and lock his door, and that was fine with us. And then he thought about it and he said, "Can I play my Nintendo too?" And we said, "Sure, you know, just when we knock on the door you have to unlock it." He's like, "Fine." He started to really anticipate that his brother was going to act up because then he got to play Nintendo. What that did for him, though, was give him a lot more control of the situation. And that really helped him a lot. And it showed my older son that he couldn't impact his brother, and it took a lot of control away from him. And so suddenly he didn't act up as quickly. So when you do plans like that, it's really in the big picture, it's helping everyone. The therapy for the other children in the family, incredibly important. Our therapists work with all of us. My son is 16 now. He can spot and feel kids who have trauma histories. He can pick them out of a room. He is so adept at it. At 16, he has no tolerance for anybody right now. But other families that I know that have children, neurotypical children, they develop into amazing people with a lot of empathy. Make sure they get the self-care and the respite. That's my two. That's Purgatory Chasm, I think, in Rhode Island. So, you know, they go hiking together and they did stuff together, but they also had their own times alone. So this is a long haul. Even if we adopt them at 5 or 6, my job is not over. He's 23 and my job is certainly not over. So it's important to look at your life and do what you can to sustain and nourish you during all of this. Find hobbies, obviously working within your time barriers, but you can do it, and you need to do it to give yourself the strength to keep going. We talk about this at the Attachment and Trauma Network because we support all families. There are just some situations where a child cannot be in the home. After everything that's been done, it comes to a point where the child cannot be in a home, in that home. In the past 10 years, there's been a huge increase in long-term respite opportunities and residential treatment facilities. Some are geared towards children with trauma history. Some are actually, they're seeing mostly adopted children anyhow, so they're kind of specializing in that. and some of them are both facilities and schools. We do talk about dissolution because for some families it's what has to happen. Whatever services they did or did not get, they've made that decision. And supporting those families, we just tell them to get the professional help that they need and make sure everyone is getting counseling. We certainly, rehoming is not the right way to do it, and that's not what dissolution necessarily means, but it's an option for families that have done everything that they can do. We have several families that have children who came from a dissolved adoption, and long term you can see it wasn't the right fit. And so it's important to see that, but to get all the professional help to make that evaluation. You've got the ideas in your mind that this child is here for a reason. He's with you for a reason. And so work with your gut. Understand that you're your child's best advocate. And if you are, you know, working as an educational surrogate parent, understand that you are the one who understands this child better, you know, than a lot of other people, and you need to make sure you get that across. And keep finding the little, you know, joys and humor that come along. And there's some incredible gifts that come from this as well. And it's a balance. Not every day is awful, and not every day is joyful. And you ask anyone who's raising children, and they'll probably give you that same answer. So when we talk about therapeutic parenting, a lot of that can go into education and teaching a child. And so we can see how trauma impacts children in the home. At school we see very similar parallel situations. We've got children who are showing their emotions through behaviors, and a lot of these you will see in children with trauma histories. And I'm not going to go into a lot of it because I know we're crunched for time, but it's important for teachers to start observing some of these, not necessarily in the typical way that they would observe some of these behaviors. So we've got the three main responses from our children: the fight, flight, or freeze. We also have charm and disarm, which some of our kids are very good at doing. It's a manipulation strategy that kids do. Fight usually gets the most attention from the schools, not for the right reasons necessarily, but they definitely get the most attention. The freeze, those are the quiet kids in the classroom sometimes, so they don't always get as much attention. The flight, often, you know, we're looking at children who are being diagnosed with things. If trauma history is in this child, the child in your life, if there's a trauma history and the teachers are observing attention deficit type issues, remember the trauma history. And it's important to remember that, because chances are it may not be ADHD. My child has been through the whole gambit. He started with the ADHD, he went to the bipolar diagnoses, the meds worked on and off for him. If meds can help, it's great, but really getting to the heart of the trauma is really important for these children, and it's important for the schools to know as well. Again, we've got more actions coming from them that they can see in school. And while the first thought might be that it's simply a behavior issue, if you've got a trauma history, it's the trauma talking. The thinking and cognition the teachers also see. They see a lot of these issues going on. Executive functioning is a huge one with these children, because they're developmentally not their chronological age. And so they're behind in all of that. You wouldn't ask a toddler to necessarily keep their lockers straight. And sometimes our children are functioning at a toddler level with executive functioning. So it's important for teachers to be made aware of some of these cognition issues that come with trauma. Shame's huge in our children. My son at 23 is ruled by shame. He's worked on his traumas, but this is where he's at. And you can see shame work both ways, and the low self-esteem, they can either be bullied or they can be the bullies. So it's important to have the teachers observe and report. And if you're working in an IEP situation, these are things that can be brought up to show that, no, this is a trauma issue, not necessarily all the other things that they think might be going on as well. They do mistrust They generally mistrust until it can be proven differently. And again, our children will spike with vacations and changes. So we look at the ideas of what helps children in school. We've got the idea of being safe and supported. Trauma-sensitive schools, they're training all across the country now. It makes a huge difference for all the students, not just the students with trauma history. I would recommend that you can Google Paper Tigers. It's a fantastic movie about a trauma-sensitive school on the West Coast. We have a school in Albany, New York, where it's the same situation, although there's no movie made of it. It's a girls' school for troubled girls, and the principal went in about 4 years ago and realized he needed to do some more trauma-informed work, and they've just had a huge change in the school. The police only had to come one time last year, which is incredible when you understand the backgrounds that these girls have. So we've got the ideas in a classroom that they can't learn unless they're regulated. They can't get regulated unless they're connected, and they can't feel safe. All these things happen before a child can learn. So it's important that teachers understand that those first three, safe, connection, and regulation, have to happen before they're going to be ready to learn. If they flip their lid, there's no learning. The school in Albany works very well with getting the girls to understand that they flipped their lid, but their whole goal is to get them back in the classroom. And so by doing the first three, they're getting them back in the classroom much faster. Teachers can work on relationship and regulation by modeling the behaviors and by doing things a little bit differently, not being so rigid, giving the children a little bit more leeway in their success, giving them the breaks that they need, but not unstructured breaks. Teach them the flip the lid idea so that they can communicate with you in a much better way. Some kids actually just use the hand signal, and that keys the teacher in to the fact that they're having a difficult time. Remembering that the behaviors at school are the child's way of communicating. It's not the child's way of making the teacher miserable or ruining the other student's day. It feels like it to the students, and it feels like it to the teachers, but it's important to remember it's communication. This is where we suggest that if the teachers are seeing a lot of behaviors, that they take some detailed observations and they express that to you so that you can work with your therapist too to see what's behind the behaviors and what can be changed to maybe keep those behaviors down. And when you're working with schools, it's important to remember that nobody's bad. There are no, it's not a bad teacher, it's not a bad kid, it's not a bad, not bad parents. We all fall into that judgmental, depending on where we stand. It's very easy for us to say, well, this teacher isn't doing this for my child, they must be bad. No, they're not. Most of the time they're overworked and they need whatever help that they can get. And parents aren't bad either. They're doing the best they can. So you're looking at all of this to go together. Safety, trust, collaboration, choice, and empowerment. All of that goes together to help a student with a trauma history be more successful at school, which means keeping the behaviors down. Being able to communicate is going to make a big difference. And some of these approaches can help the children approach school in a much better light. If you've got school refusal, if you've got a child with school refusal, there's a reason why they don't want to go. For my son, it was senior year. He didn't want to grow up. He was very afraid of graduating. So we increased our therapy to help him understand the transition and that the day after he graduated, he was still going to wake up in our home. He had to realize that several times over before he felt better about it. Classroom environments can also be changed. It's important, I think, going through all of this, understanding that just like home, their feeling of safety is different from a teacher's feeling of safety. So felt safety is very important to a student. And even if it means moving some desks around or maybe not placing the child in a classroom that's right by a side door, That's something that a lot of kids have problems with. Things like that. Those little changes can make a big difference. You can also do more having sensory rooms as schools become more trauma sensitive. The idea of calming things. Glitter wands are very popular with some of the schools that we've worked with. It's glitter's moving very slowly through a wand, and the child can just watch it. It helps them calm down and regulate. And no unstructured time. We just heard this from my 16-year-old's high school principal. Unstructured time is bullying time. And so it's very important that your child is not in unstructured time as much as possible. Briefly. Oh, sorry about that. Behavior modification systems, it's 2017. We know that they don't really work, especially with children with trauma issues. Talk to the schools. The shaming models, if they still exist, should not be used on our children. They shouldn't be used on children, but these are things to talk about with the school. That any kind of sticker charts, you know, write the name on the board and then they get 3 check marks next to them. Very difficult for children with trauma histories to deal with, and it's not going to help them. Understand a lot of their behaviors are not won'ts, but it can'ts. They can't do something at a certain point. If they flip their lid, they cannot do a math assignment. So it's important that teachers start to see this, and that whoever's working with your child understand that as well. Get the schools to start looking what's under the behavior. Very, very important. These are some ideas of what works for behaviors. Again, works for the parents, works for the schools. The idea of modeling repair and apology. Not just saying they're sorry, because, you know, we know how it sounds when they say they're sorry and they don't mean it. But using that opportunity instead of a punishment or a detention, let's do something else. Let's work in work with the teacher to maybe move the desks around, or the child threw something. Well, can you help me pick up some stuff together? You're doing it together, you're connecting, you're learning how to co-regulate by watching the teacher do the same thing. 10 in schools, getting the trauma-informed thought process in there usually has to start at the top and work its way down. So meetings with principals, superintendents, very helpful. Being the right advocate when you go in for your student or for your child is important. You need to strike this balance. You need to be assertive, but in a polite way. And, you know, we are super people apparently, because this is what we have to do for our kids. Being on the team, it's important to go in there with, this is what the child needs. This isn't what I want, but this is what the child needs. Ask observation questions of the teachers. What are you seeing? When is it happening? How long did it take for them to resolve? All of those questions will help. What intervention did you use, and how did that work? Those can help a lot to point out that maybe some of these interventions aren't working for a child with a trauma history. Communication with the teachers. Just this past month, we had a school that in Massachusetts that denies that there were any phone conversations with a parent. That shouldn't be happening in 2017, but it still does. And it's very important that you document everything. Even after a phone conversation, a follow-up email. Emails are great because, you know, you can print them out, you can keep them. The mother was able to find the phone records to show that, yes, we did speak on 2 occasions this semester. So communication is important, and working with the teacher, understanding the teacher's time restrictions as well. But it's only going to be better if you can talk back and forth with the teacher. We have a list of information at the end here. Take a look at the ACEs study. Start to understand the data. Bring it in and share it with the teachers. It goes a long way for them. The advocates here, I'm sure the surrogates also know the law of Massachusetts, understand what the child's rights are as far as IEPs go. And, you know, throughout all of the meetings, make sure that you're being respectful through all of it. Even if you get to the point where you disagree, prepare for the meeting. You know, we're on the same page until we're not. So there are options for, if you feel that that child's needs are still not being met, There's the education advocates. There's the documentation. Know all of that and follow through on that to get the child what they need. There are options for families where private school or public school doesn't necessarily work for them. Homeschooling is difficult in a family with a traumatized child. I've seen it work. We were advised not to do it because of the control issues we had with our son, but it can be a really great way to connect with your child. Virtual school is becoming an option. Our executive director used the virtual school system because the behavior school system in Georgia is actually horrific. And she was able to pull her daughter out and use the virtual school, which is there are still teachers teaching your child on a computer at home. You are a parent coach. So it's that one level of separation that helps a lot. And these are some of the suggested readings. And if there are any questions? Yeah.
Actually, we are set for time.
Mm-hmm.
There are some questions that I think that we can handle afterwards and send through
Sure.
email to people. So a couple of different questions from people. So we will get back to you on that. Again, thank you, Stephanie, for coming in. It was very informative, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.